Welcome to Sarder TV. I'm Stephanie Haney, and today we're sitting down with Murray Nossel, the author of Powered by Storytelling. Thank you so much for joining us today, Murray.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So you have had a very interesting and varied career. What can you tell us about your experience in London theater as well as off-Broadway performance in New York?
London theatre came as quite a surprise to me. I never studied theatre. I never expected to be on the West End in London, to be honest with you. But somehow the story of my life led me there. And I'd like to tell you that story.
Yes, please.
So when I was 12 years old, I was in a Jewish day school in Johannesburg, South Africa. And we were on the first day of high school, 12 years old. And the teacher says, turn to the person next to you and tell one another a story. And there's a fellow sitting next to me, his name's Paul, and he tells me a story. And then he says to me, Murray, tell me your story. And I say, oh, I don't have a story. Oh, go on, Murray, everyone has a story. No, really, I just don't have one. And my face went blood red. I blushed all the way from my neck up to the top of my head. Anyhow, Paul was not one of the boys who called me names during the break time. He wasn't one of the people who called me Murray, you sissy, you fag, you pansy, all those kinds of things. He never said those things. But one day, we were in the second to last year of high school, which we in South Africa called Form 4. And the teacher can't control the class. So she herds us out of the classroom, and she says in Afrikaans, because that was the class we were in, Afrikaans, Seuns links, meisies rechts, which means boys on the left and girls on the right. And Paul points to me and says, and Murray in the middle. And once again, my face went red and the entire class laughed. He tried to say hello to me when we went to university, because all of a sudden I was smoking cigarettes. If you can believe it, I had long blonde hair. I was surrounded by people. And he said to me, hi, and I turned my head the other way. And I never saw him again. I got to New York in 1990. And I had said goodbye to everyone in South Africa. I'm leaving clinical psychology behind. I'm coming to be a playwright in New York City. And I arrive here in the middle of an AIDS epidemic. I'm living on Christopher Street, and people, young men my age, are walking down the street with these dark purple marks on their faces, being pushed in wheelchairs, dying. Anyway, I hand my play to a friend of mine who had a theater. And she said to me, you need a director to direct your play. So I meet this guy who she introduces me to. He's French-Canadian, man by the name of Simon Fortin. And he says, oh, I'd like to do your play. I think it would be a good play to do. And by the way, Murray, do you by any chance know my boyfriend? And I say, well, who would that be? And he says, Paul Brody. Same guy.
Oh my goodness.
So here we are, 10,000 miles away from home, 20 years later. So the play opens and Paul comes over to me. My heart is pounding. He says to me, Murray, great play. I say to him, Paul, what an amazing coincidence that we should meet like this. And he says to me, listen, there's something that's been bothering me for many, many years now. Do you remember that thing I said to you outside the classroom? And I said, yes, I do remember. And he said to me, I'm so sorry. I have felt bad about that for all these years. So after he apologized, he and I started talking on the phone every single day. Now, this was the time when South Africa was gearing up for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and everybody was telling their story in South Africa. And Paul and I started telling stories to one another. All the things that had happened to us, since high school, which we hadn't connected about. And of course, he was gay, I was gay. And so we had so much to talk about. And 6 weeks later, we were riding down on the train to Brooklyn, and Paul said to me, Murray, I'm HIV positive. And my jaw just dropped, because, people were dying at that time of HIV, of AIDS. this is the story that Paul and I tell in this performance called Two Men Talking. Now, Paul is still alive. And so we took the very same story that I have just told you, and we started telling it at conferences, and we told it at a big narrative therapy conference in Adelaide, Australia. And people came up to us, this was in 2000, people came up to us and said, "You've got to put this in the theatre." And, you know, before you know it, we were off to the Young Vics Theatre in London, workshopping Two Men Talking with a British theatre director. Then we got a British Arts Council grant to take Two Men Talking across England. We were at the Edinburgh Theatre, a French theatre festival. And then we went to Trafalgar Studios in London. And then, of course, we had our off-Broadway run in New York at the Barrow Street Theatre. So, a strange,
Wow.
twisty journey. And who knew it was going to happen?
So, having worked so extensively in a traditional media like theater, what can you tell us about how storytelling in new media is different, like in podcasting and other formats?
You know, storytelling is our human birthright. We've been telling stories for millions of years. When I say millions, that really comes directly from the mouth of one of South Africa's greatest paleoanthropologists, whose work was really seminal in looking at the origins of humankind. Before we could speak, we could sing. We were imitating the sounds of the animals. So we've been telling stories since the origins of our species. And in a sense, no matter what the medium is, a story is a story. In my definition of a story, it has a beginning, it has an emotional turning point, and it has an end. So it doesn't matter what the medium is. However, there are different ways of communicating stories. So in the oral tradition, such as what I'm doing right now, as I'm telling you a story as a three-dimensional being on camera, you can see me. You can see the expressions on my face. You can see my hand gestures. So the totality of me is telling the story, and I'm engaging with the totality of you, the listener. A podcast or radio is something different. You're driving in your car, you're listening to someone telling a story, but you don't have that visual association. So, and then of course, there's the mass of social media that's out there. And I would say that there's a lot of claiming that things are stories, when in fact they're not stories at all. So for instance, your Facebook profile is not a story. It's a profile. It's a collection of elements. You may choose to combine those elements into a story that can be shared with other people, a story that has direction, that has purpose, that's communicating a message, but it's not necessarily a story. So the new media is using the word story a lot, but that's not accurate as far as I'm concerned, in terms of really adhering to the kind of classic form of what storytelling is.
I think that's a really interesting and really valid perspective, because when we're sharing these stories on social media, it's really more like a snapshot. We're not getting that whole arc that you talked about.
Yes, it's a snapshot. And a snapshot doesn't create context. You know, Daniel Pink, who wrote this incredible book called A Whole New Mind, you know, describes story as context enriched by emotion. You need to have context. You need to understand that I developed the storytelling method, for instance, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, when people were dying without leaving anything behind, and they needed to leave something behind, and their stories are what they could leave behind. You need that context to understand my story.
So another thing that's important when you're making choices when it comes to storytelling is what stories to focus on and what stories to even share. You have the World Mother Storytelling Project. What can you tell us about specifically why you've chosen to focus on stories of mothers throughout the world?
At some point during this interview that we're having, you're going to ask me, what is learning to me? And I'm going to say to you that learning is the ability to listen to your own life. Now, what I mean by that is that everything you need for a story, to tell a story, is right in front of you. You've just got to listen very openly to your own life. So, the World Mother Storytelling Project has a very personal meaning to me, and it started in a very personal way. And that's crucial to the listening and storytelling method that's described in my book, for instance, that it's about the personal story. It's about looking into your own life to find the stories. So on the 10th of October 2006, I received a phone call from my sister to tell me that my parents in Johannesburg had been carjacked and that they had been held hostage in their car for 3.5 hours. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned. I woke up my partner and I said to him, I am having the worst thought I could possibly have in my life. And he said, what's that? And I said, I know that my parents are living because my sister knew that they had come through this. But the worst thought that I could possibly have is that my mother had been raped. So early the next morning, I had to wait until the sun rose in Johannesburg. I was in New York. I called my mom. Mom, are you okay? Yes, darling, how are you? She told me the story of how she and my father had been carjacked at gunpoint, and how when the carjackers saw another car coming towards them, they pushed my mom into the back of her car, 2 gunmen on either side. My dad was in the passenger seat, and they raced off into the night. And my mother said to me, you know that they were taking us to kill us in some remote place and leave our bodies there, because the car had a police tracking device, and if they let us go, the police could have tracked the car. My mother said to me, you live once and you die once, and I realized this is how I'm going to die. But she said, I looked up and I saw your father sitting there and he was so sick. And I said to the carjackers, please, please do not hurt my husband. They didn't say anything. Anyhow, they drove my parents to the outskirts of Johannesburg, where there are these old, unused gold mines. And they said to my parents, get out of the car. And my mother said, this was the moment. They were going to shoot us. And my mother said, no, I'm not getting out of the car. You can't do this to us. We refuse. We are sitting right here. So eventually, they called their friends on a cell phone to come around, fellow criminals, to pick up my parents. They were transferred from the one car to the other, and the people in the second car drove my parents around Johannesburg for 3.5 hours until such time as my mother's car's tracking device had been dismantled. And in the second car, my mother began to engage in a conversation with the second group of hijackers. Why do you do this? They told her it was because of, apartheid, and they couldn't find jobs, and she apologized to them for the evils of apartheid. Then she gave them advice about what to do with their lives so they didn't have to steal cars. And eventually they dropped my parents back at my father's nursing home. Now, I began to tell the story to people about my mother and what she had done, and people said, what an amazing mother you've got.
Absolutely.
I said, you must be mistaken. She's not wonderful at all. She was a concert pianist when I was growing up. She worked day and night. She was a neglectful mother. I was raised by nannies. I spent 30 years in therapy complaining about my mother. How can you say she's wonderful? And then people said, but look what she did. She put your father's needs before her own. She said to them, don't hurt my husband. She developed this relationship with the carjackers. She had the strength of character not to get out of the car. Man, Mary, that is some mother you've got. Oh my God, they must be right. I didn't realize. I'd been blind to who my mother was because I was so focused on my own prejudices and biases and assumptions about that my mother should have been there at home taking care of us rather than working, which was unusual for women, when I was a child. So I went back to South Africa and I made a movie about my mother, which is not cut yet, it's not finished yet, but I got to really know my mother. And at one point, my mother sat across the kitchen table from me in Johannesburg and she said to me, "Darling, you don't really know me, do you?" And I said, "No, Mum, I don't." So that was the origin of the World Mother Storytelling Project, because in all the work that I've done subsequently around the world, working with marginalized people in many different countries, Croatia, Tanzania, Kenya, Moldova, Ukraine, Lithuania, I've noticed the same thing. Mothers' stories are pushed under. Mothers don't get to tell their stories. And I feel like that in this world that we're living in at the moment, where there is so much war, there's so much conflict, there's so much greed, and the perpetrators are men. And I have to confess that as a man. And that we need, if we are to survive as a species, we need to tap into the knowledges of those who gave birth to us, those who nurtured us, those who understand deep down inside the value of life, and that is the mothers. So that's why it is my profound commitment to create a worldwide movement to teach children how to listen to the stories of their mothers and to extract those stories from those mothers so that they can be passed down the generations.
Can you tell us a little bit about Narrative and what inspired you to found Narrative specifically?
Okay, so I'd love to tell you the story. So, I'm standing in front of a white door in the basement of a building on Willoughby Street in Brooklyn. And on the door is a laboratory specimen box with a kind of skull and crossbones on it. And it says, "Dangerous, hazardous human waste material." And I walk in, vinyl floors, everything smells of pine sol, and I go into my supervisor's office. He says to me, "Murray, you're not a clinical psychologist anymore. Leave that behind you. This is an AIDS program. People come here during the day and your job is to help people come to terms with the fact that they are dying." Now the year is 1994, and this is before the cocktail came out that has totally changed the face of the AIDS epidemic worldwide. So then people had no medications and people were dying. And he said to me, "You have to do anything that you can to help these people come to terms with the fact that they are dying." So I go back out and meet the patients in the program. They were called clients, actually. I go out and meet the clients in the program. And one of them is a man who tells me that he wants to get married. I said to him, "You have 7 T cells. Most of us have 1,000. You may not live very long at all. How can you do this to a woman, get married to her, when you may die very soon?" I went back to my supervisor. I said, "This man is in denial. He doesn't realize what's happening to him. He's on death's doorstep." My supervisor says to me, "Murray, you have to start with where the client is, not with your own fixed assumptions about what's good or bad for them. It's his life. Meet the woman who he's going to marry or wants to marry, talk to her and see where they stand." So I called her into the office. She said to me, "I don't care how long he lives. He deserves to die knowing that he was loved." So 2 weeks later, there I stood at a funeral home in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, looking at his body in an open casket and in his wedding suit. And there she was, and she said to me, "I've just got married and I'm already a widow." She said, "But at least he died knowing that he was loved." So I went back and my approach to my clients changed. I began to ask them how they felt. Like, what's it like to be you? How are you feeling? Well, they rolled their eyes at me and said, "What kind of question is that, Murray? How would you feel if you knew you were dying?" I mean, honestly, what are they teaching you there? I was doing my PhD in social work at the time, and, you know, I was supposed to know how to communicate with these clients. Anyhow, I went back to my supervisor and I said to him, you know, these patients don't have any insight. I can't do therapy with them. He said, this is not about doing therapy. You have to leave what you knew behind. And you have to learn what they need. Now, learning can be very humbling. You come into a clinic like that with a set of expertise as a clinical psychologist. All of a sudden, none of that works. Therapy doesn't work. Telling them, interpreting how they feel doesn't work. What am I going to do? I was left with the only thing that I could do. Listen. I stopped doing anything. And I just listened and I observed. Because that's how you learn. And what did I notice? What did I learn? I learned that people were dying every week in that program. Sometimes 2 people would die in a week. And 2 days later, their belongings would show up in the secretary's office in a black garbage bag. And nobody came to claim those garbage bags. So people were dying, leaving nothing behind. No one was coming to claim what they had. And for those who were still living, they saw that's what's going to become of me when I die. I'm going to end up in a black garbage bag too. And my name's going to end up being one of those endless names engraved on a little brass plate the size of a packet of chewing gum. So I said to my supervisor, I think I should start a storytelling group here. And my job would just be to listen to the client's stories, and their job would be to tell their stories. So one of the clients said to me, "Oh, Murray, give me a break. I'm a crack addict, for God's sake. I've spent my entire life in the alleys of Brooklyn scoring crack. That's not a story." I said, "Yes, that is a story. That's your story, and your only job is to say, what happened to you? And I guarantee you I won't interrupt. I won't ask you how you feel. I won't tell you what to do. I will simply listen to your story, because this is your life. This is what happened to you, and you deserve for your story to go out into the future to all of those of us who listen." So she came in alone to my storytelling group, and then she went back out into the common room and said, "You know that guy, Murray? He might be a white South African, but you can trust him." And by Christmas of 1994, my storytelling group was filled with people listening and telling stories. And one woman came to me and said to me, "Murray, my daughter will never know me. She's 3 years old and I'm going to die before she ever knows me. Could you make a videotape of my story?" And I did that. And then all the clients in the program wanted videotapes that they could leave behind as their legacy. And in early '95, when the New York state legislators were threatening cutbacks to people with HIV and AIDS, my clients went up to Albany and they left their videotapes on the desks of the legislators. And they said, "You listen to my story and then tell me I don't deserve services." And it's those stories, not only the stories of my clients, but all the stories that were told during that period by AIDS activists all over the world. It's those personal stories that changed the face of the epidemic. It wasn't the statistics, it wasn't the numbers, it wasn't the graphs, it was the stories that touched people's hearts. And that is the basis of the work that I still do today. In all the work that I do in corporations, in all the work that I do in organizations, when I'm teaching in the narrative medicine program at Columbia, this is what I teach: how to listen and tell personal stories.
How does your approach differ when you're in a more intimate setting versus when you're in a large group of, say, 500 people?
An intimate setting allows me to have very personal connections with people. Let's say I'm running a group with 18 leaders of a corporation, the 18 in the C-suite. I can basically make a personal connection with each person. I can definitely listen to something that each person has to say. And people have more of an opportunity to try things out and be critiqued by me in terms of our method, because we have a method. So people can get much more individualized attention when it's a small group. But a large group has different benefits. A group of 500, for instance, you have the inspirational effect of storytelling on this group of people. It's like a rock concert in a way, because if you tell a story or somebody tells a story on stage and they genuinely acknowledge the listening of the audience, then you have this magic happening where everyone in that audience goes out there and they want to tell their story as well. So the intimate and the large have their own virtues. You can guess, of course, which I prefer. You know, I always wanted to be a rock star, so I really love those big audiences. But, you know, it's really the connection with people for me that counts. And I love more than anything to get stories out of people. So really the size of the group is to some extent irrelevant. So in a small group, if I'm working with a smaller group, everybody has a chance to try out telling their story. And I'm able to critique them according to the what happened storytelling method. In a large audience, obviously I can't work with everybody. So I work with volunteers who come up onto the stage, and then I help them to excavate, craft, and present their stories, and those in the audience are watching it being modeled. So they then need to go and try it for themselves, either in a smaller group setting or on their own. So it's really the extent of engagement which changes from small group to larger audience.
I'm so glad that you mentioned excavation, crafting, and presenting, because that is your proven 3-step storytelling method.
Yes.
So can you elaborate on that just a little bit as we go into more detail on it later?
Everything you need to be an effective storyteller is right there with you. You do not need to go looking outside of your own experience to find your story. It's all there. The first question you need to ask when you want to be a storyteller or when you want to tell a story, it's a pair of questions. It starts with why story and why now. So you first have to ask yourself the question, why do I want to tell a story as distinct from all the other ways in which I could possibly communicate? A snapshot, a tweet, a graph, an instruction manual, statistics. Why story? Story is the most powerful way of communicating because it's hardwired into our brains to follow this beginning, middle, end trajectory. Stories are the most powerful ways of communicating messages. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what message do I want to communicate here? What's my message? And then, what story am I going to tell to communicate that message? And why now? What's the urgency of this moment to tell my story? For my AIDS clients way back then, the urgency to tell their stories that they were dying and they needed to leave their stories behind. And they needed to advocate for changes in AIDS policy. Every person needs to ask, what is the thing that's waking me up to tell my story right now? Why is this the moment? Once you've asked those questions, once you've answered those questions, you are ready to begin excavating your own life for these stories, looking back over your own experiences. Where do you start? You start with your heritage. Where do I come from? Who came before me? Think about your grandparents, think about your parents, think about your childhood. Begin to identify these memories. Let the memories bubble up to the surface. And then you begin to capture those memories. You write them down. You take note of them. Now, memory, remembering, is an act of creation. Because when you allow these memories to bubble up to the surface and you capture them, that is the raw material that your stories are going to be made of. And the more you remember, the more memories will come up to the surface. And then you are ready to start crafting those memories into a story. And you craft that by selecting a discrete experience that has a beginning, middle, and end that's going to communicate your why story, why now question. So you craft your story out of those memories that you've excavated, and then finally you need to present your story. Now, presentation is everything, because in presentation you are connecting with your listeners. You are connecting with your audience. One of the most important things that I teach is that connection to your audience is primary. You're telling a story because you want to connect to people. I call it the lion's gaze. You know that when you throw a ball to a dog, the dog follows the ball. But when you throw a ball at a lion, the lion keeps its gaze on you. As a storyteller, your lion's gaze is on your audience. So the reason that you excavate and craft is finally to present and connect to your audience. Those are the three fundamental steps of narratives, listening, and storytelling method.
Is the way that someone engages in storytelling different in the business setting versus the personal setting?
There is no difference between storytelling in the personal setting and the business setting. When it comes to sharing a story, you are doing the same thing no matter what the context is. You are reaching into your own experience and you are crafting a narrative, a story that's going to connect with your listener. Now, what makes the difference between personal storytelling and business storytelling is the question, why story, why now? Would I stand up in front of a group of people in a corporation and tell them that my niece has applied to 7 different colleges? No, because really it has no business purpose whatsoever. Would I say that story, tell that story to my friends around dinner? Yes, because I want to tell them how my niece is doing. So really, what determines the story that you tell is the purpose of the story. So if I'm telling a story in a business setting, I have to know what my message is in the business setting. It's not just telling any personal story that comes to mind. It's telling a personal story that is strategically orientated towards your audience in that moment. Now, I tell the story of working with AIDS patients in every single company I've ever worked with. I always start my workshops and trainings with that, because that story communicates for me the power of storytelling. That's why I tell it. It's a deeply personal story, but it communicates my message.
So when you talk about the purpose of choosing a particular story for a particular situation, one purpose that I think is pretty prevalent in business is resolving conflicts. So how can storytelling be used to resolve conflicts in business?
Mostly, conflict is caused by a breakdown in understanding. So you come to me with a whole set of assumptions about me, who I am, what I'm doing, and how I'm doing it. And I'm coming to you with the same set of assumptions. You don't perform the way that I want you to, in some way, let's say in a business setting. You don't say what I wanted you to say, you don't behave the way I wanted you to behave, you disagree with me. You fail to perform a task that I asked you to perform, and you get annoyed with me based on your assumptions about me, based on your feelings that are bubbling up at that time. Then I counteract that with my opinions, judgments, and feelings. So before you know it, we are in a conflict situation because we've strayed away from the actual task at hand or the performance goal, and we are now stuck in an emotional whirl that has to do with assumptions, feelings, judgments, opinions, and a breakdown in the communication between the two of us. So how does the listening and storytelling method help us to resolve conflict? Firstly, the first task is to listen, to learn how to listen openly without judgment and opinion. So can I just listen to your version of what happened without interrupting you and without judging you? And then, once I've done that, and we switch around, can you just listen to my point of view? Now there's a second piece to this. I'm not just telling you my opinions and my judgments, because if I tell you how I feel about something, well, I feel that you're not doing your job properly. And you say, well, I feel like you're a jerk most of the time. Well, I'm a jerk most of the time because you don't listen to me. Well, I don't listen to you because you have no respect for me. You see how you just get into this downward spiral because you're busy with assumptions and judgments and opinions and feelings? So we say, let those go and simply exchange accounts of what happened. When I say a what happened account, I mean something that the five senses could sense. If you can't smell it, see it, taste it, hear it, or touch it, it does not exist. So instead of getting into how you feel and what your assumptions are, I'll simply say, what happened from your point of view? What happened? And then you'll tell me. And then I'll say, well, let me tell you what happened from my point of view. We're just exchanging factual accounts of what happened, and we're not getting into all the feelings and the emotions. So I can give you an example of how this happened. So I was working in an organization in which there had been a long-standing director, and everybody loved him. They could go into his office and share their problems with him, and he listened with a sympathetic ear, and he always had an open door policy. And he died of a heart attack. And he was replaced by a new person. And the new person came in and closed his door. And even though he organized a certain moment in every week, which was called Straight Talk with Dave, people would come in and they would say to me, you can't talk straight with Dave because Dave doesn't listen. You know, you're trying to talk to him and he's looking down at papers on his desk and he's obviously distracted. And really, there was a tremendous divide growing in this company where people just didn't trust the new director. And they started going around him and making their own decisions and disregarding his decisions. And eventually he came to us and he said, I've got a huge problem here. You know, I have a total breakdown of communication in my company. You know, people really are, they don't want to have anything to do with me. So we really had to sit everybody down in a circle. And we had to say to Dave, listen, you need to be able to listen to what everyone has to say to you without interrupting with them, without stopping them. You've just got to listen very openly to what it's like for people to work with you. And they all did that. And then Dave said to them, well, you've got to understand what it's like for me to walk into this setting where you all loved my predecessor. And I've walked in here and I feel like I'm already set up to lose the game. So that's how we were able to resolve the conflict in that organization. Just give everyone an opportunity to tell their story in a context of open and non-judgmental listening. And that's easier said than done.
So when you were sharing that story with us about the total breakdown in communication,
Yeah.
and then you brought storytelling to them to sort of fix that conflict, can you give us a little bit more about how storytelling enhances communication in general?
Well, when you have a breakdown in communication, you also have a breakdown in empathy. If I feel like you've wronged me in some way, it's going to be very difficult for me to feel empathic for you at that moment. you've hurt me, you've wronged me. I'm not seeing you any longer as a three-dimensional human being. I'm seeing you as someone who has the power and the capacity to hurt me. So, what's it going to take for me to actually now see you as a three-dimensional human being? Your story. If you tell me what it's like to be you, if you tell me what that situation was like from your perspective, like when Dave told people what it was like to come to this organization where everyone kept on talking about his predecessor, and there was no way that he could live up to that, then they were able to empathize with him. Hold on a second, I see that coming in the way we were before was very difficult. In fact, some of the time what would happen is that when they talked about the predecessor, a lot of them would burst into tears. So, when Dave tells his story, not give his opinion, not give his judgment, but actually say what happened to him, and the other people to say what happened to them, there is a spark of connection that happens, and that connection happens in our brains. So that's how we transform communication. If you are listening and I am telling a story, there is that opportunity for the spark of connection. So that's how storytelling enhances communication, because it is a unique form of communication that's hardwired into our brains. We are looking out for the ending from the moment that a story begins.
As we get a little bit further into your book, you share that listening is a vessel that shapes a story.
Yes, the essence of transforming communication in narratives method is the reciprocity between listening and storytelling. There is no storytelling without listening. That's the point. So listening is the vessel that shapes the storytelling. Just as a vase gives shape to the liquid that's poured into it, so does listening give shape to the story. Your listening right now, Stephanie, is shaping my telling. It's the unique way in which you're listening, the way in which you're looking at me, the almost imperceptible quality of gesture in your face that shows me that you're listening and how you're listening. And that is shaping my telling. This is fundamental to narratives method. It's a listening and storytelling method. The one cannot exist without the other. So in order to transform communication in the business setting or in the workplace, you are not only training people to tell stories, you are also training them on how to listen to one another openly and without judgment, so that they're actually able to receive those stories.
And what are some barriers to listening that you sort of have to coach people beyond?
There are multiple barriers to listening. There's so many different things that are impinging on our ability to listen. So let's take external obstacles first, things that are just in the environment, okay? Well, here we are in New York City right now. And as I was walking to the office, there was a jackhammer going, there were people yelling, there were taxis honking, you know, it's just like the movies of being in New York City, you know. Could you possibly listen to someone in all that din? No. So that's an external obstacle. Temperature, if it's too hot, if it's too cold. And then, of course, there is the external obstacle, environmental obstacle, that is a real, huge problem at the moment, and that is technology. So you are sitting at your desk and you are talking on the phone to someone, and a message comes up on your computer screen, or your cell phone vibrates, or a text comes up on your cell phone and it says urgent. So at the moment, because of technology, we are bombarded with multiple stimuli, multiple. So learning how to deal with these is very, very difficult, because many people are actually addicted to the sense of continuous stimulation that's coming from these instruments. So let's call those external or environmental obstacles. Then let's look at the physiological obstacles. If you're tired, if you've got a headache, if you've got an aching back, if you didn't get a lot of sleep the night before, these are all ways in which your body, your physiological body, is actually an obstacle to listening. Then we can think about these kinds of inner obstacles. And by inner obstacles, I simply mean the noise, the inner noise that's going on in your mind all the time. You don't even know what it is. It's just noise. Suddenly the laundry list comes into your head, you know, and the thing that you're going to be doing after work today, and you get a sudden feeling of animosity towards someone you don't even realize why, and all of a sudden you get a little twinge of anxiety. So it's all this kind of inchoate noise that happens. That's an obstacle to listening. Then there are all the judgments and interpretations that we make about people. Oh, you know, so-and-so never listens to me. They don't pay attention to what I'm saying. And you're busy thinking this while you're talking in a meeting about the other person. So these are psychological obstacles. You're making meanings out of things that become obstacles. And finally, there are relational obstacles. The power dimension. You listen very differently to the CEO than you maybe listen to the guy in the mailroom because of the power differential. So these are the obstacles. They are environmental, they are physiological, they are internal, i.e. thoughts and emotions. They are meaning-making, such as judgments and interpretations. So these are the psychological obstacles to listening. And then finally, there are relational obstacles to listening.
When we talk about the obstacles to listening, one obstacle, it seems, is timing is always of the essence. So how do you make time for listening?
How do you make time for anything in your life? You simply say, I'm going to make time for this. The first thing has to be that you decide that this is something valuable to do. It's valuable to listen. It's valuable to tell stories. And I am going to have to find a dedicated time and space to do this, because I know that if I don't do that, there are going to be too many obstacles, right? So the first thing is that you decide to make time. Now, here in New York City, we are always in such a rush. You're rushing here, you're rushing there, you've got a million things to do. Well, at the end of your day, if you look back and you take an inventory of what you did that was actually productive, you will be shocked by how much time you actually wasted on just spinning your wheels. So, my cameraman and beloved friend, Eddie Maritz, when we're on a shoot together and the sun's going down and we are losing light, and it's like, come, quickly, we've got to get this interview. And he says to me, when you're in a big hurry, it's a sure sign that you should slow down. It's counterintuitive, because when you're in a hurry and you try to do everything really fast, it's going to have no quality. It's going to be lacking in quality. So slow down. Do it slowly. This takes discipline. It takes the ability to say to yourself, stop, and deal with what's important, deal with what's in front of you. So what I recommend is that in a company, if you're going to make stories a priority, because stories are the key element in a learning organization, I would contend. It's through the stories that you actually capture the mistakes and are able to transmit them to other people, and it's from those mistakes that we learn. Now, you can't just do that while you're standing at the water cooler. You've got to create a specific time in the week. Let's all sit down, turn off our cell phones, make sure that the temperature is controlled, make sure that there are no interruptions, and let's exchange stories about what we've learned, about mistakes that we've made. And I guarantee you, the benefit to the organization is going to be beyond imagination when you create that dedicated time and space. But the first thing is you have to decide that it's important. And of course that has to come from the top. The person at the top has to say, storytelling is important and we need to make time for it.
So once you have convinced that person in that leadership role that it is important to set this time and this space, this meeting, if you will, for listening, how do you help coach that leader to listen as well as do everything else they're doing while they're remaining focused on leading that meeting?
That's such a great question. So I go and work in an organization, and the leader is dead keen on storytelling. It's a startup. They realize that everyone in the startup needs to be able to tell their story. The startup has grown exponentially to hundreds of people, and I go in to meet this leader. And while I'm talking to her, she's on her cell phone. Then she puts the cell phone down, then it vibrates, then she's on it again. Then another person in the meeting picks up their cell phone. Then there's another person in the meeting who's busy typing on his laptop. Well, it's like, here I am teaching you about the reciprocal relationship between listening and telling, and you're all multitasking while I'm talking to you. Is this how you operate all the time? Yes, it is how we operate all the time, because we feel like time is of the essence. Time is so valuable in this speeded up startup culture that we have to seize on every opportunity to do our work. Well, that's not going to work. And I said to the CEO, are you willing to go into these dedicated times and space for storytelling and not have any of your devices with you? And she agreed. And they then started a formula for how meetings were going to be conducted. So whereas everyone had previously come into the meeting and were working on their laptops making notes, there was now one dedicated note keeper who took notes during the meeting. And there was a revolving thing where one person each time would be chosen to take the notes and circulate them, the notes among the people, and everyone else had to listen. And each meeting would also start with people going around and saying if there were any current obstacles getting in the way of their ability to listen. So it was a way of identifying those obstacles and releasing them as a way of starting each meeting so that people could just focus on the tasks at hand after that. So the leader had to be willing to put her money where her mouth was. If she doesn't do that, it will not work.
So you mentioned in that particular story that there was one dedicated record keeper in that meeting. Do you think that that's the best approach to recording meetings? Because you've mentioned that's important in your book as well.
Yes. I think it's really important to have a dedicated note keeper, because the dedicated note keeper is also what I would call the dedicated listener, right? So you are relying on the listening of other people when you're speaking in a meeting. And you should know that there's at least one person who's sitting there who is dedicated to absolutely everything that you're saying. My business partner, Jerome DeRoy, is a brilliant note taker. And I know that when I'm having a meeting and we are gathering information to write a proposal, for instance, I know that he's taking every single note that has to be taken, and that will be converted into a document that will become our proposal afterwards. So he has learned how to be a dedicated listener. And what that allows me to be is fully present with whoever else is sitting at that table in that moment. When I'm not taking notes, I can be fully present. Now, when a meeting is very, very important, so for instance, when history is being made in an organization, a new decision is being made, or a company is pivoting, and there's a meeting to talk about the pivot, then I turn on the recorder as well. I put on a recording device so you can capture absolutely everything that happened in that meeting.
So we touched on identifying the obstacles to listening, and you mentioned releasing those obstacles. How can we do that? How can we release those obstacles?
The first step in releasing obstacles to listening is to be aware of the fact that there are obstacles to listening. A lot of the time, we just try to work around whatever our obstacles are, rather than actually noticing, hey, this is an obstacle. So if you're sitting in a room where there's a jackhammer going on next door, it probably behooves you to move to another room if you can, rather than just put up with it. So the first step in releasing obstacles to listening is be aware of what's getting in the way of your ability to listen. And if there's something you can do about it in the moment, then do something about it in the moment. If you're thirsty, drink a glass of water. If it's too hot in the room, turn up the AC. Do what you can. But then there are certain situations where you just have a hard time letting go of a thought, for instance. If I am sitting in a meeting and I'm thinking, why did Jim get that promotion and I didn't? And you are stewing about it. You just have to be aware of the fact that you're having this thought, and you have to use your breath as a way of trying to release it through the breath, just so that you can be present. Be aware of your body sitting in that seat, Ask yourself, what's the purpose of my sitting in this meeting right now? What do I want to achieve by sitting in this meeting? But those psychological obstacles sometimes are very, very difficult. You have to do the best that you can. And you have to say that for this period, this defined period, I'm going to let go of judgments, opinions, and these strong and dominant feelings, and I'll pick up with them afterwards, right? So then, let's say that I've got a real problem with Jim, or I've got a real problem with someone in the office, and it's getting in the way of my ability to listen. Then I might say it there and then. Listen, Jane, yesterday I tried to tell you that we should have phoned the client back. And you said to me, no, it was too soon. And now I feel like you're blaming me for doing that. And that's just really getting in the way of my ability to listen. So you might have to say those kinds of tough things in a meeting. But that, of course, depends on Jane's ability to listen openly and without judgment or defensiveness. So it takes a lot of practice and a lot of skill. This method is not a free-for-all. It's not therapy. It's about getting rid of the obstacles so that you can carry on with the work at hand and be very close to your business purpose. So you're engaging your personal being as a way of not leaving anything behind, not hiding anything. We can't be storytellers if we're blocking things. But at the same time, if we get overly caught up in our emotions and feelings, then we're just losing our effectiveness.
Going along those lines, we're talking a lot about personal narrative and how that's effective in the business field. When did it first occur to you that personal narrative had a place in the business environment?
Well, it took a bit of a risk, I have to say, to trying out personal storytelling in the business environment. One of the vice presidents of auditing at Time Warner came to us and he said he was having a conference for all the auditors in the company, worldwide. And he wanted something really special that was out of the box for auditors, right? And could I come in and do a listening and storytelling training? I said, yes, and congratulations to you for being so, courageous and having such vision. Because he said, auditors really need to tell their stories because they are some of the most misunderstood people in the organization. People see them as number crunchers that are always out to say no. And they don't see them as people in the organization who are actually trying to make things happen for the creatives, for instance, or the production teams. Like the auditors are your friends, they're not your enemies. So he thought, well, if auditors were able to tell stories and engage with people on a very personal level where the mind and heart are connected, people would see the auditors as much more fully three-dimensional. So I said, okay, I've got just the exercise for you. And I go to this group of 60 auditors from around the world, and I put them all in a giant circle. And first I teach them all how to listen to one another. And then I say, we're going to go around the circle, and each one of you is going to present yourself as one of your 4 grandparents. You're going to introduce yourself as one of your 4 grandparents in the first person. So instead of saying, hi, my name is Murray, I would say, hi, my name is Anne. And I would tell the story of my grandmother in the first person. Well, people told stories you can't even imagine. For many of the people in that group, they were the first generation who'd ever been to college. They told the stories of their grandparents who'd been cotton pickers and fisher people on, in the Caribbean. And how these grandparents had worked so hard to give them the lives that they had now. We learned about people who'd come over from Italy and Poland and Scotland and Ireland and the kinds of, traumas that had brought people to the United States. And then to see these grandchildren, succeeding and working in this beautiful organization in this beautiful room. Now, one of the VPs in that room burst into tears while telling his grandparents' story. And he was quite nervous about this. Are people going to trust me after I've shown such vulnerability? On the contrary, they said to him, we trust you even more because we now see who you are as a human being. So I felt that if personal storytelling of such an intimate variety could work with a group of auditors, it could work for anyone. And it has, and it does.
So when you're presenting this program to people, something that comes to mind for me is that stigma that it's not personal, it's business. Do you come up against that, people being resistant, and how do you overcome that if you do?
Yeah, I often have people saying to me, this is business, and you've got to leave the personal behind. When I did the same grandparent exercise in Cyprus for a large media corporation, I had quite a lot of resistance from some of the people in leadership positions. And they said to me, I don't come to work to find meaning. I get meaning from my family on the weekends. For me, work is all about business and filling the shareholders' pockets. Now that is a very outdated way of seeing business. That is seeing business the way we used to describe it on the factory floor when you are creating widgets on a conveyor belt and people have to be completely efficient because they need to deal with that thing that's right in front of them so it can go down the conveyor belt. And if a person breaks down, then you're breaking down the whole operation. But that's not the world we're living in now. We're living in the information age where innovation and creativity and the ability to make smart decisions in the moment is primary. So how can we leave who we are behind as people, as personalities, when what's being asked of us is to be who we are? So it's a false distinction to say that there's a personal story and there's a business story. Business stories can be personal, but they have to be targeted. They have to be strategic. You have to ask yourself that question. Why story? Why now? Not every personal story belongs in business. You should only tell a personal story if it is the best way to communicate that message that you want to communicate. And you have to choose the story that's best going to do it. One of my clients is a chief business officer at Condé Nast. He wants his team to operate as one. He's just brought 4 different publications together. He was previously the chief business officer of one publication, and he now has 4 that he wants to bring together as a team. So what does he do? He tells a story of how he was in a football team at high school, and when he was kicked off the team, he lost interest in the team. He only thought about himself and what it meant to him until his father came to him and said to him, you need to put your team first. And you need to face what's happened to you and think about the team. And that's the story that he shares with his staff. Well, they're sitting there with their mouths hanging open. He's revealed this very personal thing, and yet it's spot on in terms of the message that he's wanting to convey. So again, you don't just tell any personal story at work for the sake of connecting with people. No. If you are telling a story because you want to communicate a message, you've got to ask the question, why story and why now?
How do you determine if something is too personal to share?
We all know that feeling where you walk out of a situation and you've said too much. oh, I said too much. You feel a little sort of upset and a little overexposed. I just said too much. I shouldn't have gone that far. We all know when we feel that way. You never want to do that in the work setting. Don't do something that's going to expose you just for the sake of exposing you. Don't be vulnerable just for the sake of being vulnerable. Know why you're telling the story. You know, that's the most important thing. You have to know why. The second thing is you've got to be prepared. You can't just go, if you're going to tell a personal story that's intimate and meaningful to you, you can't just wing it in the moment. You've got to work on excavating and crafting that story so that you're ready to tell it. So I would go so far as to say that if a story is not ready to be told, you probably haven't prepared hard enough. Because if you prepared hard enough, you'll know that this is something you want to share with other people. But my advice would be, don't tell a story until it's ready to be told. Don't do it. It will backfire on you because you'll go back into a state of self-consciousness rather than focusing on your lion's gaze, which is connecting with your audience.
How do you make sure that your story rises above all the white noise of everything else out there and actually lands and gets listened to?
Ah, now there's the rub. You've asked the most important question of all. Let's have a look at the survival of a story. Which stories survive? Which stories stand the test of time? The best stories do. Think about the Bible. Now that story has survived. It's a very good story. It's got a lot of messages in it. It's jam-packed full of messages because there's something in it for the listener. So if you want to rise above all the other white noise, think about your audience. Who am I wanting to connect to? What's in it for them? I'm telling you this because I want to share something with you that's in it for you. And I'm going to reach into my personal experience from life, from my personal, family life, from my childhood, from my business experience, from my sports experience. And I'm going to share this story with you not because I want to look good and I want to sort of shine the stars on my lapel, but I want to really share something with you. So for instance, when I tell the story of working with the AIDS patients in the 90s, I really want everyone listening to that story to feel it's urgent for me to go out and tell my story, because life is finite. And if I don't tell my story, no one will ever hear it. So the other way to make sure that your story survives is you have to spend time on it. You have to spend time excavating, looking into your experience, and really finding those nuggets. And every single one of us has nuggets of gold if you look into your own experience. We've all got multiple stories that can be told. And they might be tiny little stories that you thought nothing of, but that communicate such a powerful message.
When it comes to preparing that story to be told, your focus is on crafting the what happened version of a story. Tell us more about that.
If you ask any screenwriter, playwright, novelist, what's the most important thing to remember when telling a story, they're going to say, show, don't tell. What you want to do through your story is engage your listener. When I tell you a story, I want you to be right there with me, as if it happened to you as well. Now, the way to do that is to engage your senses. In other words, I want you to smell what I smelled, taste what I tasted, see what I saw, hear what I heard, feel what I felt. In other words, touched. So the what happened method really is this kind of very factual, sensory account of things. And everything else has to be discarded. So I felt upset. You can't do that because it can't be seen, touched, tasted, heard, or smelled. I felt upset. You have to say, for instance, we're at a meeting and I say, I'm actually finding that Jennifer is very sullen at the moment. And I think that she's being a bit passive-aggressive. All right? So what is that? It's an opinion. It's an opinion. It's a psychological interpretation. There's no what happened there. There's nothing that I could see or hear or touch. So I need to actually tell you what happened, okay? I walked over to Jennifer's desk the other day, and she was looking down. She was staring down at the keyboard. And I said to her, Jennifer, what's wrong? And she said, no, nothing. Nothing's wrong. I'm just tired. Anyway, later that day, I was speaking to Bob, and he said to me, you know, Jennifer came to meet with us to talk about the project, and I found her very silent. So that's something that was actually said. You can hear it. You can see it. So we have to show in the what happened method. We are not telling. I like to think of it as the what happened camera. This is a very special camera that can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. And that's what the stories are driven by. You know, I could say to you, for instance, when I'm telling my story about working with AIDS patients, the patients were all very angry. But I don't say that. I say, well, my patient Sharon said to me, Murray, what kind of nonsense is this? How can you ask me how am I feeling? How would you feel if you knew you were going to die? I'm using dialogue there, you see, to communicate what happened, rather than just stating an abstract opinion.
You share some great examples in the book of the What Happened method. Can you share one of those with us?
Well, of course, yes. Of course, there's this Victoria, who's just scored a big deal by getting funding for her company. And she is the one who's at the party in New York City, and she's the one who has to sort of break the good news to the team and celebrate. And she stands in front of the team and she said, we did it. We made it. That's it. And she came to me and told me the story, and she said to me, I feel so disappointed in myself. I had so much that I wanted to share with the team, and all I could say was this kind of useless sentence. So we started excavating her story. And one of the things that she told me was that she had been a prodigy pianist growing up as a child in Hong Kong, and that she had actually collapsed during a performance due to a panic attack. And that she was so terrified of having such a panic attack when she was talking to her team that she was unable to communicate what she wanted to communicate, which is how incredible she felt to be part of this company. So I coached her on excavating that very story about how she broke down on stage, and that's what she shared with her team at the next time that they gathered. And they were like, wow, we had no idea that you'd ever played the piano. We had no idea that you came from this background. We had no idea that you actually were such a feeling person. They'd seen her as very cut off. So she became fully dimensionalized when she was able to tell just what happened to her and trust that people would be able to listen to that and accept that without any judgment.
When you talk about being a feeling person and the importance of conveying that to others, something else you mentioned in the book is the importance of empathy in building team and rapport. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to be able to imagine, how does that person feel? Where is that person coming from? The minute that I fail to see you as a fellow human being who wants, just like I do, to succeed and contribute to the whole, communication is going to break down and trust is going to break down. Empathy is the ability to actually connect with others because you are all working towards the same performance goal. We are all in this together. We are all human. We are all trying to do the best that we can. How can we support one another in reaching our goals? Now, this is not business as usual. We live in a very competitive world where people are thinking about themselves, and often your success depends on pushing someone down, or that's the way that it's perceived. This is a breakdown in empathy. But more and more people are having to operate as teams. And more people are talking about connecting with the end user, connecting with the customer, connecting with the client. Now, how are you going to connect with a client if you can't empathize with them and really know what it's like to be them? That begins at home. That begins in the office. When you are actually able to empathize with people and connect with them and work together towards a shared goal, then that same kind of empathy and connection is going to radiate out towards your users, your clients, your shareholders, your stakeholders. Why is storytelling so powerful? One of the things that many people in business are now saying is that story is powerful because it connects the head to the heart. People who are very customer-centric are beginning to see that you can't only reach the customer's mind, head mind. You've also got to reach their heart mind. Stories, as Daniel Pink tells us, are context enriched by emotion. Okay? We want to connect with people on this emotional level. We want them to open their heart. So what does that take? It takes empathy. It takes the ability to actually see the other person as human, just like you're human. So if you're going to just see the person as a role or as a function, you are not connecting mind with heart. And particularly on a team, like the story that Craig Kostelich from Condé Nast tells us, that when Craig was a football player in high school, for that team to win, they had to be bonded, they had to be fused, they had to care about one another more than they even cared about themselves. And that took the ability to empathize with one another. He's bringing that same philosophy into the work environment. For us to function as a team and to really pull together and collaborate, we need to be able to see one another as fully three-dimensional. And that's tough for some people in the work environment because they see that as exposing yourself too much. So that's the way that the work environment now is having to transform, because so much now is about connecting with the audience, that we're living in a world that's so media heavy. We're all talking about connection. And you asked earlier, how do you rise above it? How do you rise above all that white noise? Well, you rise above the white noise by touching people at the heart level. When someone gets moved, they get engaged. And when you tell a story that has a very distinct emotional turning point to it, when you talk about something that's meaningful to you, that happened to you, that you want to share with others as a way of passing a message along, that will touch people at the heart level. And that's what empathy is about. And from a listening perspective, empathy is about listening with an open heart rather than with a closed heart.
So what is it about storytelling specifically that helps foster that sense of teamwork and collaboration that's so important in business today?
Well, it's our stories that create that spark of connection. I've never been a football player, but when Craig Kostelich tells the story about his experiences on the football team and how when he was thrown off the team, he went into a sulk and wanted to even move towns and move to another school. And his father said to him, "No, you can't just run away from failure. You have to face your failure and learn from it." Now, I may never have played football, but I have exactly those same experiences of having failed and wanted to run away rather than face my failure, see what I could learn from it, and re-engage with those around me rather than, withdraw into my own cocoon. So really these stories, when we share them and we know what their purpose is, we are doing it really because we want to connect with other people. That's the primary reason that we want to tell stories. We want to create that spark of connection. That's where the magic happens. That's where the creativity happens. That's where the innovation happens.
In your book, you also talk about the challenges that arrive when it comes to the point where you're bridging the gap between crafting the story and presenting the story. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, when you craft your story, you're really wanting to take the raw material of your experience, in other words, these memories that you've jotted down, and you're now crafting it into something with a beginning and an end. And somewhere in the middle of that, there has to be this key moment in your life, what I call an emotional turning point, something where the emotions ran very high. Now remember, when you tell that story, you're not going to be talking about the emotions or describing the emotions. You're going to be saying what happened. Now, you've crafted your story, and all of a sudden you're in front of an audience and you're presenting it. That's the tongue tip test here. That is where you are really seeing how your story lands and how your story is going to land with that audience. Remember that every audience brings its unique bowl of listening that's going to shape your story. So you need to be very flexible, and you need to know that you may have to adapt your story so that it's going to land for certain kinds of audiences. So in a sense, you're always in a state of crafting. Crafting is something that's ongoing, and presenting, you always have to be in a learning mode. You always have to be open to what else you could possibly put into your story that is going to make it land for your audience. So at the same time, you're disciplined and your structure in creating your story, you also have to be open to new elements that might come into it.
Another thing that you mention when you're getting a story ready to be told is the importance of knowing the end of that story. What is the danger if you begin telling a story that you don't necessarily know the end to?
Danger of telling a story without knowing the ending is that your story will not work. You may as well not even tell the story. This is like a pilot taking off from the airport and not knowing where he or she is going. They'll just fly around randomly. They don't know what their destination is. If you're telling a 4-minute story, which I've determined is the best amount of time to tell a story, it's the most effective time, 4 minutes, not too long, not too short. The moment you start telling your story, you better know where you're headed. You've got to be directing towards your ending the moment you start telling that story. That's what's going to keep your story tight. You only put details in that matter. You know, you only add those things that are going to really take you towards your ending. So you must know where you're going when you tell a story. Otherwise, you will lose your audience. We've all fallen into our, nodded off at the dinner table with people who go into too much detail and are rambling along without knowing what they're doing. Storytelling is very strategic. It's very purposeful. You need to know why you're telling it. And what I do when I'm training people to tell their stories and they start to present, I say to them, tell me your last line first. I want to be absolutely confident that you know where you're going. So your end of your story is the thing that resolves your story, and it's the thing that makes everything else in your story add up.
As you mentioned, the audience and the listeners shape the story. So what are some tools that you've developed for tailoring a particular story to a certain audience?
Well, the first thing you need to do when you're going to be presenting to an audience is you must understand what's meaningful to that audience. And if you can get your mind around this one, you have to listen to the listening. How are these people going to be listening to me? What are they going to be listening for? I need to do my research. I need to understand. So when I go into any organization to work with the team, it always starts off with a questionnaire where I'm asking people to tell me about themselves, to share what's important for them in the work environment, to say why they find storytelling important. So I'm beginning to understand who I'm talking to, and I'm beginning to gather those little nuggets that are going to tell me how to emphasize certain aspects of my story. So for instance, if I am talking to an advocacy group, right, and advocating for change is what's important to them, Then when I tell my story of working in the AIDS program, I'm going to emphasize how these clients used their videotapes, took them and left them on the desks of the legislators, and used those stories as a way of advocating for social and political change. If I'm talking to people about learning from your mistakes, then I might tell the story about how I tried to practice traditional psychotherapy with my dying patients, and it didn't work, and I had to go back and learn from my mistakes. So you need to know, in a sense, what's important to your audience so that you can place your emphasis. Now, the other thing is that you need to be willing to be engaged with your audience right now and in that moment. Because it's those imperceptible cues that you get that tell you whether something's landing or it's not landing. So part of the trick of presenting a story, one of the reasons we work so hard on crafting our story and knowing the beginning, middle, and end, is so that you can let all of that go and just be present with the audience when you're telling the story. You're not thinking about it. You're not trying to remember it. It's there. It's lodged in your body. Your body remembers the whole story because it happened to you. So you must be willing to make these little adaptations when you are addressing your audience to suit that audience. And that means tuning into that audience, keeping your lion's gaze on the audience.
Has there ever been a scenario where you've read an audience, you thought you had the perfect approach to telling a story, but then you're in the middle of telling it and you realize it's not resonating the way you want to? And can you share that with us and how you reacted?
You know, it's so funny because it shows you how the listening shapes the telling. I had a certain story in mind that I was going to tell now, but your listening has somehow reminded me of an experience right now that I'd forgotten about for ages. So, Paul and I were doing Two Men Talking, and we were traveling down the east coast of England. And each night we played in a different theatre. And we always tell this very personal story of how we met and you know, how Paul teased me and then he told me he was HIV positive. And one of the places that we are performing at is called the Hat Factory in Luton. It's the most beautiful theatre. It's got 300 seats, and there are 6 people in the audience. 6 people, and they are spread all over the theatre. And one is a young man who was sitting there with his parents. And Paul and I start telling our story and doing all the things we usually do in our performance. We sing, we dance, we tell our stories. Well, this kid burst into laughter, and he couldn't stop laughing, and he had his head in his hands, and he was absolutely shaking with laughter. And we had to go on. I mean, we had a job to do. We had to tell that story, but I don't feel like we really had the listening of that audience. It was just too much. It was too personal. You know, looking back on it, we should have really pulled back, you know, and really done something that was so much more appropriate for such a tiny audience. But we just marched on, and I suppose in some way we weren't really reading our audience correctly. We just carried on doing what we had to do rather than think about what worked in that situation. So when Paul and I first started performing Two Men Talking, and we were at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, well, people would come into the audience there. They'd been drinking at the bar, and one of the guys came in one day and he laid himself across about 7 seats with his great big gallon of beer, whatever he was drinking. And, you know, Paul and I are sharing these very intimate personal stories. So we went to our producer afterwards, Scott Morphy, who'd come over from New York, and we said, can you believe what this guy did? He came in there and he was drinking a beer. How are we supposed to work under these circumstances? And Scott said to us, never judge your audience. Your audience are there to watch you, and they owe you absolutely nothing. If your audience isn't listening, then you have to do something to get the listening of your audience. You have to adapt. You have to work with what's there. You can't blame the audience and make them wrong. So yes, and by telling my story 8 times a week in theatres, when there were only 6 people sometimes, or when there was someone lying down across 5 seats, or when there were 1,000 people, that was where I learned how you really have to keep on with it, you have to keep going, but you have to stay with your audience. You can't suddenly disconnect from the audience and then just go through the motions, because if you just go through the motions, you will lose your connection with the audience. Do what you can, even if it's difficult.
So we've talked a lot today about drawing from the wealth of our personal experiences when it comes to choosing the appropriate story. So when you're working with a corporate client, how do you help them choose the most relevant story out of everything they have in their well to really connect with whoever they're trying to connect with? How do you help them choose that best story?
Well, the best stories are those which have to do with overcoming obstacles. When did we have to learn a painful lesson? What was that turning point in our lives that made us go in one direction or the other? When I'm starting off working with people telling stories, I advise them to go to these big moments in their lives. When you become a much more experienced storyteller, you can start going for the much subtler, small stuff. But when you're starting out, go for the big moments. The moments where you were down on your knees and you didn't know what to do, and somehow you found your way back again. These are the stories that move us. You know, we as a species learned how to tell stories. The reason why our brains were hardwired to tell stories was we wanted to pass down important survival information to our next of kin. How to find food, how to find shelter, how to find clothing. So it's the same as storytelling in an organization. You're wanting to pass along important information. And that important information usually resides in the places where you got stuck and you had to overcome an obstacle. That's where the learning occurred. Craig Kostelich tells us about the moment where he was thrown off the football team. A doctor, a researcher in a pharmaceutical organization who is wanting to explain to the salespeople why the drug that she's working on is so important, tells us about the fact that her father's dementia could actually have been helped by his having this particular drug. I'm just going to say that a different way. So I worked with a woman who's a doctor in a pharmaceutical company, and she's reaching for a story where she can actually explain to the salespeople what this drug actually does. And she thinks back to her father, who himself was a very beloved doctor in China, and how he had to stop his practice because he started suffering from dementia. And the drug that she's working on would have helped him. Now, this is a woman who usually would not tell a personal story. She's a scientist. But when she told about the meaning of this drug that she's working on for her, those salespeople really got it. So go to those places even that scare you. Go to those places that even you run away from a little bit. They're just human. All of us humans have to deal with the fact that we're born, we're going to get sick, and we're going to die. We all have to deal with that. We're going to get old. So we all can relate to that.
Can you share an experience that you've had with working with one of your many high-profile global clients?
Indeed, I can. So I was performing Two Men Talking with Paul on the West End of London, and somebody from one of the world's biggest media companies came up to me after the performance, and she said, could you train a group of people who are attending our annual conference? Now, she explained to me that this company had what they called an emerging markets division, and that people from 40 or more countries were going to be coming together to really form a new team. And these were countries in Asia, Russia, Poland, former Eastern Bloc countries, Africa, Egypt, Israel, Iran, all coming together to become a team. She said, and it's very challenging because some of these people come from countries that actually hate one another and have been at war with one another. So you're going to have to form some kind of connection between these people who come from warring countries. I say, I would love to do this, and I fly off to Cyprus, the country where East meets West. And I've talked to the vice president who's going to be running this entire conference, and he says, you know, we want to create magic. We want to do something that's really extraordinary here, something that's really out of the box. And I know exactly what to do. I'm going to do my grandparent exercise. I'm going to take a circle of people and get them to share their grandparent stories with one another, because all of us have had a grandparent. It's the thing that unites all of us. And it's going to be this amazing way of communicating to everyone what your legacy is, what your heritage is, what's important to you. Anyway, so I'm at the conference and everyone's assembled, and I give an introductory talk about storytelling and the power of storytelling, and the VP gives me the thumbs up. So I give the instruction. People are going to go around the circle and they're going to present themselves in the first person as one of their 4 grandparents. A woman from Iran starts. She tells the story of her grandmother, who at a very young age became a widow and then was sold into marriage a second time and had multiple children. The woman began to cry. Her neighbor tried to comfort her, gave her a tissue. I said, listen, emotions are very welcome here. We are sharing stories with one another. We are sharing ourselves with one another. Just because someone cries while they're telling a story doesn't mean they need to be taken care of. It's fine. Emotions are just a part of storytelling. Second woman tells her story. She's a Belgian woman. And she tells the story of how her grandmother experienced the famine. And she begins to cry. And the next person begins to cry too. And each time I'm saying, listen, this is part of storytelling. If we're really genuinely talking about connecting head to heart, we've got to experience emotions. Why wouldn't we? So now, after these 3 people have told their stories, I'm now checking in with the listeners. Are there any obstacles to listening? One must always check in with the listeners. Well, a man stands up. He's from Germany. He says, listen, well, you know all what happened to my grandparents. You know, they were Nazis, and we know about that. And I'd feel very uncomfortable talking about my grandparents. And then somebody else says, oh, women. Weak. They're so weak. Look at them, all of them in tears here. That's the reason why women don't advance in organizations. They don't know how to manage their emotions. Then finally, the VP stands up. He starts screaming at me. If I would have known you were going to upset my people like this, I would never have hired you. I don't like my people to be put into such uncomfortable situations. What was I to do? I just stood there and listened. I listened to the obstacles to listening, right? That's my job. Listen openly and let them go. I said to the vice president, are you done? Are you finished? Anything more you want to say so that you can carry on listening? Oh, I guess I'm done. Let's continue then. And so I listened to all those grandparent stories. At the airport, I was leaving the airport in Larnaca, and a man from Singapore came up to me. He said, wow, that was quite a conference. We've never had anything quite like that before. I said, well, how was it for you? He said, you put a golden string through our hearts in a very mystical way. And then, just as a preparation for writing my book, I went back to one of the business leaders who had attended that conference, and I said to him, tell me, you know, we're going back 10 years now, but could you tell me, what did you think about that conference? He said it was the right thing for the right occasion. We needed something powerful that would bring us all together. He said it was one of the most memorable trainings I've ever been to, but it was also one of the most controversial, because people were not used to be taken outside of their comfort zones. So that was 10 years ago, and the world has come a long way since then. But I was quite amazed to hear about the attitudes towards women that were still prevalent in this very progressive company 10 years ago.
When we talk about engaging with our audience, what are your top tips for making sure that you're staying present to engage with your audience and being that active storyteller and listener at the same time?
Okay, you want to engage with your audience? Firstly, know the ending of your story. Craft the story with a beginning, middle, and end, and really prepare in telling that story. That's the first thing. You do not want to be standing with an audience in front of you thinking about what story you're going to tell. It has to be ready to go. So that's the first thing. Find your ending, because finding your ending means that you already know what the beginning and the middle of the story is. The second is connect to your body. When you are standing on stage or when you are sitting at that desk and you're about to tell your story, you might find yourself flying off into outer space in terms of your mind. You might feel light or lightheaded, or you might have a knot in your stomach. Ground yourself. Take a moment before you start, just to make sure that you are inside your own body. I know that that sounds really obvious, but I know from our own experience of being on stage that you can just go onto stage, you see those spotlights coming up, the audience are sitting there, and you rush into it without taking that moment just to take a breath and gather yourself. That is very, very important. And then the third thing is your lion's gaze. You are there to connect to your listeners. Your listeners are bringing you the precious gift of their bowl of listening. And really your primary motivation for this is to connect with them. So look at that audience. Look at people. You know, you might even, if you're standing on a stage, you might even want to move around the stage a little bit so that you can connect with different people in the audience. Look around, you know, notice people. Bring yourself back to that lion's gaze. If you find yourself chasing after your own thoughts or trying to remember your story, you're like a dog chasing after the ball. It's even okay to say to an audience, oh my goodness, I forgot where I was going. Hold on a second, let me gather my thoughts again. That keeps you present with the audience, rather than thinking that you have to keep that to yourself. Audiences love it when you reel with them. They just love it. They eat up every moment of it because they know that you're there present with them in the moment. And that's what keeps it really exciting. And it makes the audience feel very special when you share something with them like that, that maybe you even forgotten aspect of your story and you have to gather it back again to share with them.
How can your method turn anyone into a better storyteller?
My method can turn anybody into a better storyteller because it's a method. Right? It's a 7-step process for learning how to tell a story, right? You start with asking the question, why story, why now? Right? You then go on to asking yourself, what are your obstacles to listening? Because you have recognized that there's a reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. You then release those obstacles to listening, and there's a step-by-step process for doing that, which has been codified in the book. The next thing is you remember your heritage. You tell your own grandparents' story. You connect yourself to your own memories by remembering your grandparents, remembering those who came before you, remembering where they came from, and the struggles they had to go through so that you could be where you are right now. This has the function of opening your heart, of opening those memory channels to the stories that are really significant. You then craft your story. You tell what happened, you find your ending, and you connect with your audience. And in this method, you will learn exactly how to do each one of those things. And this method, as I've told you already, was developed in 1994 in an AIDS program, and it has been in a constant state of innovation since then. And it's worked on tens of thousands of people in multiple languages across the world, independent of race, independent of gender, sexual orientation, even educational levels. And the reason that it works is that our brains are hardwired for it. All I'm doing is I'm tapping into what the brain can already do. I'm just reminding people what's already there.
I know from our talk today that our audience is going to find this incredibly valuable. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your time with us today.
Thank you, Stephanie, and really thank you for your listening today, because really it's that listening that brought out things that I've never said before and in ways that I've never said before. So I really appreciate the particular quality of your listening.
I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for watching Sarder TV.